Night has fallen, the world is quiet, and the misty seas are knocking at our door. I am NightSleepWhisper. Tonight, in one continuous journey, you will hear a massive 50-chapter detective mystery. Secrets hidden for decades, a lost diamond watch, and Detective Victor King's final, toughest case. You will feel the ship and the soft whisper of the waves. Now, take a deep breath and let yourself go into the flow of the narrative. I'll see you at the deepest point of your sleep. Victor lived in a small house near the park. He was a retired detective. For 30 years, he caught thieves and solved difficult puzzles. Now, he lived a very quiet life. He woke up early every morning. He made a pot of hot coffee. He read the newspaper from the first page to the last page. His house was very clean. Every book was in its place. He was 65 years old, and he was often bored. One Tuesday morning, something changed. Victor was sitting by the window. The sky was grey, and a light rain was falling. He heard a soft sound at his front door. The mail arrived. He walked to the hallway and saw a thick envelope on the floor. It was not a bill. It was not a magazine. The envelope was made of expensive, heavy paper. His name was written in elegant gold letters. Victor sat at his kitchen table and opened the envelope. He used a small silver knife to cut the paper. Inside, he found a card with a gold border. "Dear Mr. Victor King." The card said, "You are a man of great skill. I invite you to a private voyage on my luxury yacht, the Silver Star. We leave from Pier 47 this Friday at midnight. Please bring your suitcase. All your needs will be met. I hope to see you there." The letter was signed by a friend. There was no other name. Victor looked at the gold letters. He did not have many friends left. Most of his old co-workers were also retired or lived far away. Who was this friend? Victor felt a spark of curiosity. He looked at his quiet kitchen. The clock on the wall made a steady, rhythmic sound. Usually, this sound made him feel calm. Today, it made him feel restless. He wanted to do something different. He wanted to solve a mystery again. He walked to his bedroom and pulled a large suitcase from under the bed. He blew the dust off the top. He began to choose his clothes carefully. He packed a heavy grey sweater for the cold sea wind. He packed a dark suit for dinner. Finally, he reached into his desk drawer. He took out a small, leather-bound notebook and a fountain pen. A luxury yacht. Victor whispered, "The Silver Star." He wondered who the other guests were. He wondered why the host remained a secret. Most people would be afraid of a strange invitation. But Victor was not most people. He was a detective. To him, a secret was just a question waiting for an answer. He closed his suitcase and locked it. He was ready to leave his quiet life behind for a few days. He felt young again. The taxi drove through the quiet streets of the city. It was almost midnight on Friday. The street lamps cast long shadows on the road. Victor sat in the back seat and looked at his watch. It was 11:45. He was on time. The car turned a corner, and the smell of the sea filled the air. It smelled like salt and cold water. The taxi stopped at the entrance of Pier 47. Victor gave the driver some money and stepped out into the cold night. The wind was stronger here by the water. He pulled his heavy coat tight around his chest. He took his suitcase and began to walk. The pier was long and made of old, dark wood. His shoes made a steady, rhythmic sound on the boards as he walked toward the end. Everything was very quiet. Most of the other boats were dark and silent. Their tall masts moved slowly in the wind. But at the very end of the pier, there was a bright, glowing light. Victor walked toward it. A thick, grey fog moved over the water. It moved around his legs like a ghost. Suddenly, the fog opened, and he saw a magnificent sight. The Silver Star was a very large yacht. It was painted a brilliant white color. It looked like a giant pearl against the black water. The boat had 3 levels, and the windows were large and clean. Yellow light shone from inside the rooms. It looked warm and very expensive. On the side of the boat, the name was written in large, silver letters. Silver Star. A tall man stood at the bottom of the stairs. He wore a dark blue uniform and a matching hat. He had a grey beard and a very serious face. He looked at Victor's face carefully as the detective approached. "Good evening, sir," the man said. His voice was deep and calm. "Are you Mr. Victor King?" "Yes, I am," Victor replied. He looked at the man's eyes. They were sharp and clever. "I am the captain," the man said. He did not offer his hand to shake. Instead, he reached out and took Victor's heavy suitcase. "The other guests are already waiting in the main lounge. We leave the harbor in 10 minutes. Please, follow me." Victor followed the captain up the wooden stairs. The wood was smooth and expensive. The air on the boat smelled like lemons and fresh wax. Victor looked at the dark water below. The small waves hit the side of the boat with a soft, steady rhythm. He felt a sense of excitement, but he also felt a little bit of worry. He did not know these people, and he did not know the host. They reached a large, heavy door made of glass and polished metal. The captain opened it, and a wave of warm air came out. Victor stepped inside. The floor was covered in a soft, red carpet. The walls were decorated with beautiful paintings of the ocean. He could hear the low voices of adults talking in the next room. His journey was finally beginning. Victor stepped into the main lounge of the Silver Star. The room was very large and beautiful. The walls were made of dark wood, and the ceiling had many small, bright lights. In the center of the room, there were several soft, blue chairs and a long table made of glass. 3 people were already sitting there. They all looked up when Victor entered. The captain stood by the door. "Everyone," he said in his deep voice, "this is Mr. Victor King. He is our final guest." A woman in a long black dress stood up. She was about 60 years old. She wore many gold necklaces and a very large diamond ring on her finger. Her face was elegant, but her eyes looked a bit sad. "I am Mrs. Gable," she said. She gave Victor a small, polite smile. "I am a widow. My husband loved the sea, so I decided to come on this trip." Next to her sat a man with short, gray hair and glasses. He wore a neat brown suit. He was holding a small black medical bag on his lap. He did not stand up, but he nodded his head at Victor. "I am Dr. Aries," the man said quietly. "I am a doctor in the city. I needed a vacation from my hospital." He looked tired, and he did not say much else. The third person was a younger man with very white teeth and a friendly face. He wore a clean white shirt. He stood up and walked toward Victor with a big smile. "And I am Julian," he said. "I am a chef. Perhaps you have seen my face on television. I have a famous restaurant in the capital. I am here to cook the most wonderful meals for all of you." Victor looked at the 3 adults. They all looked very different, but they all had one thing in common. They were all holding the same gold-bordered invitation card. "Did any of you meet our host yet?" Victor asked. He looked around the room, but he saw no one else. "No," Julian replied. He looked at his invitation. The letter said the host would meet us after the boat leaves the harbor. "We are all waiting." Mrs. Gable sat back down in her blue chair. "It is very strange," she whispered. "I do not usually go on boats with strangers, but the letter was so kind. It said I would find peace here." Suddenly, the floor beneath their feet began to vibrate. A low, Deep hum started deep inside the boat. The engine was working. Victor looked out of the large glass window. The lights of the city were slowly moving away. The Silver Star was leaving the pier. The black water of the ocean was now all around them. They were alone on the sea with a secret host. The group moved from the lounge to the dining room. The room was even more beautiful than the lounge. A long table stood in the middle. It was covered with a white cloth. There were silver forks, knives, and expensive glass cups. Julian, the chef, disappeared into the kitchen for a moment. He returned with several large plates of food. "Please, eat," Julian said. He looked very proud. "Tonight we have fresh fish from the sea and sweet vegetables." Victor sat at the table. To his left sat Dr. Aries. The doctor looked at his plate but did not eat much. To his right sat Mrs. Gable. She looked very elegant in the soft light. The captain was not there. He was at the front of the boat, guiding the ship through the dark water. As they ate, the conversation was quiet. The only sound was the metal of the forks touching the plates. The big windows showed nothing but the black night. "My husband loved things like this," Mrs. Gable said suddenly. Her voice was soft. "He loved the best food and the best clothes. He was a very successful man." She reached into a small bag on her lap. She pulled out an object that made everyone stop eating. It was a large pocket watch. It was made of bright, yellow gold. The front of the watch was covered in small, white diamonds. When the light hit the watch, it sparkled like a star. This was his favorite possession, she said. She held it tightly in her hand. "It is more than 100 years old. It is worth more than this boat. I think it is the only thing I have left to remember him." Dr. Aries leaned forward. His eyes were wide behind his glasses. "It is very beautiful," he whispered. "The diamonds are very large." Julian also looked at the watch. He forgot about the food for a moment. "I have never seen anything like it," he said. "You must be very careful with such a treasure, Mrs. Gable." Victor watched the faces of the other guests. He was a detective, and he noticed how people looked at expensive things. The doctor looked surprised. The chef looked amazed. Mrs. Gable looked sad. "Is the watch safe here?" Victor asked gently. Mrs. Gable smiled. "The host said this boat is the safest place in the world. I feel safe here." She placed the watch on the table for a moment. It sat there, shining under the lights. It was a very heavy and expensive object. Victor felt a strange feeling in his chest. In his experience, when people showed expensive jewelry to strangers, trouble usually followed. After a few minutes, Mrs. Gable put the watch back into her bag. The meal continued, but no one talked about the fish anymore. Everyone was thinking about the gold and the diamonds. The Silver Star continued to move away from the land, deeper into the lonely ocean. Victor watched Julian take the empty plates to the kitchen. The dinner was finished, but the atmosphere in the room was different now. The talk about the golden watch had changed the mood. The guests were no longer just strangers eating together. They were people keeping secrets. Victor stood up and walked to the large glass windows. Earlier, he could see the distant lights of the city. Now, there was nothing. The city was gone. The stars were gone too. A thick, grey fog had surrounded the Silver Star. It looked like a heavy blanket made of smoke. "The weather is changing," Victor said. He looked at his reflection in the dark glass. Dr. Aries stood up and walked to the window. He pushed his glasses up his nose. "This fog is very thick," the doctor said. "I cannot see the water. I cannot even see the front of the boat." Mrs. Gable joined them. She was still holding her black bag very tightly. It feels like we are the only people left in the world," she whispered. Her voice was thin and a little bit afraid. Suddenly, the boat moved to the left. A large wave hit the side of the hull. The water made a loud, heavy sound against the metal. The glass cups on the table moved and made a small noise as they touched each other. Victor decided to go outside to the deck. He opened the heavy glass door. The air was very cold and wet. The fog was so thick that he could only see a few feet in front of him. The Silver Star moved through the grey world slowly. The sound of the engine was a low, constant vibration under his feet. He walked to the wooden railing and touched it. It was wet with mist. He looked down, but he could not see the waves. He could only hear the water moving around the boat. It was a very lonely feeling. He was miles away from the land, and no one knew exactly where they were. It is a perfect night for a mystery, a voice said from behind him. Victor turned around. It was the captain. He was standing in the shadows of the deck. His blue hat was wet from the fog. "Is this normal, Captain?" Victor asked. "The sea has many faces," the captain replied. He looked into the grey mist. "Tonight, the sea wants to hide. We are far from the harbor now. We are in deep water." Victor felt the cold wind on his face. He knew the captain was right. They were in deep water, and the fog was hiding everything. He looked back at the warm yellow light coming from the dining room windows. Inside, there were 3 other guests and a very expensive watch. Outside, there was only the grey fog and the dark, silent ocean. The captain nodded slowly and walked back toward the front of the boat. Victor remained on the deck for a few more minutes. The cold air helped him think, but the fog was becoming too thick to see anything at all. He decided it was time to go to his cabin and sleep. He walked across the wet wood and opened the heavy glass door to enter the warm hallway. The interior of the yacht was silent now. The other guests had already gone to their rooms. Victor walked down the long, red carpet. The walls were lined with small lamps that gave off a soft, orange light. He reached the top of the stairs that led to the lower deck where the guest cabins were located. Just as he placed his hand on the metal railing, a sound broke the silence. It was a soft, strange cry. The sound was muffled, as if someone were trying to scream but had a hand over their mouth. It came from the floor below. Victor froze. He held his breath and listened very carefully. The sound did not happen again, but the memory of it made his skin feel cold. It was a human voice, and it sounded full of fear. Victor moved quickly but quietly down the stairs. His heart was beating faster now. When he reached the bottom, he looked down the narrow hallway. There were 4 doors. One belonged to Mrs. Gable, one to Dr. Aries, one to Julian, and the last one was his own. All the doors were closed. No light came from under them. "Is someone there?" Victor asked in a low voice. No one answered. The only sound was the steady, deep hum of the ship's engine. Victor walked toward the door of Mrs. Gable's cabin. He stood outside for a moment. He thought he heard a very soft movement inside, like a chair sliding across the floor. Then, everything was silent again. He moved to the next door, which belonged to Dr. Aries. He leaned his ear against the wood. He heard nothing but the sound of his own breathing. He felt a sense of great unease. He knew what he had heard. It was not the wind, and it was not the boat. It was a person in trouble. Victor looked at the floor. The red carpet was perfectly clean. There were no marks and no signs of a struggle. He wanted to knock on the doors, but he hesitated. What if everyone was asleep? What if he was just tired and his mind was playing tricks on him? He decided to wait in the hallway for a few minutes. He stood in the shadows near the stairs. He watched the doors and waited for any sign of movement. The minutes passed slowly. The Silver Star continued to push through the dark waves. The muffled cry did not return, but Victor knew that the peace of the voyage was now over. Victor woke up early the next morning. The sun was trying to shine through the thick grey fog, but the light was weak. He did not sleep well. He kept thinking about the strange, muffled cry he heard in the hallway. He got out of bed, washed his face with cold water, and put on his grey sweater. He felt a sense of worry in his stomach. He walked up the stairs to the dining room. The smell of fresh coffee and toasted bread filled the air. Julian was already there. He was wearing a clean white apron and was busy setting the table. Dr. Aries was also there, sitting in the same chair as the night before. He looked like he had not slept at all. His eyes were red behind his glasses. "Good morning, Victor," Julian said with a small smile. "I have made a large breakfast. We have eggs, bread, and fruit." "Good morning," Victor replied. He sat down and looked at the empty chair next to him. "Where is Mrs. Gable? Is she not coming to breakfast?" Julian looked at the silver clock on the wall. "It is 8:30. She is usually very early. Maybe she is tired from the movement of the boat." They waited for 10 minutes. Then they waited for 20 minutes. The coffee in the pot became cold. The eggs on the plates did not look delicious anymore. The silence in the room became heavy and uncomfortable. "I do not like this," Dr. Aries said. He tapped his fingers on the table. "She was very excited about breakfast last night. It is not like her to be late." Victor stood up. "I will go and check on her. Perhaps she is feeling unwell." He walked out of the dining room and down the stairs to the guest cabins. The hallway was silent. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he stopped. His heart began to beat very fast. Mrs. Gable's door was not closed. It was wide open. It swung slowly with the movement of the boat. "Mrs. Gable," Victor called out. His voice was steady, but his hand was shaking slightly. There was no answer. Victor walked to the doorway and looked inside. The room was a mess. The white sheets on the bed were pulled off and lay on the floor. A chair was tipped over near the small desk. Most importantly, the small black bag that Mrs. Gable always carried was not there. Victor stepped into the room. He looked in the small bathroom, but it was empty. He looked behind the heavy curtains, but no one was there. The window was closed and locked from the inside. The room was cold, and the air smelled like the salty sea. Mrs. Gable was gone. The woman with the diamond watch had disappeared into the night, and only an empty, messy room remained. Victor turned around and saw Julian and Dr. Aries standing in the hallway behind him. Their faces were white with fear. Victor stood in the middle of the messy cabin. His eyes moved quickly from the bed to the floor. He was looking for the bright, yellow glow of the gold watch. He remembered how it shone during dinner. It was a very large and heavy object. It could not hide easily. He walked to the small wooden nightstand next to the bed. The surface was smooth and dark. There was a small, round circle in the dust where the watch usually sat. Now, the space was empty. The diamonds were gone. The gold was gone. The most expensive thing on the boat had vanished. "Is it truly gone?" Julian asked from the doorway. He looked very pale. He was holding a white kitchen towel tightly in his hands. "The watch is not here," Victor said. He spoke in a calm voice, but his heart was beating fast. "And Mrs. Gable is not here either. Look at the closet." Dr. Aries stepped into the room and opened the closet door. "Her heavy coat is still here," the doctor said. "And here are her shoes. All of them." Victor nodded. "It is a very cold night. The fog is wet and freezing. No one walks on the deck without shoes or a coat. This means she did not leave this room because she wanted to. Someone took her, or something happened very quickly." Victor knelt on the floor. He looked under the bed and behind the tipped-over chair. He found a small, white pearl near the leg of the table. He picked it up and looked at it. It was from one of Mrs. Gable's necklaces. The necklace was broken. This was a sign of a struggle. Someone had grabbed her, and the jewelry had fallen apart. "We must find her," Dr. Aries said. He looked at his black medical bag. "Perhaps she is hurt. Perhaps she is somewhere else on the boat and needs my help." "Yes," Victor agreed. "We must search every inch of the Silver Star. Julian, you know the kitchen and the storage rooms best. Go there now. Doctor, please check the lounge and the small library on the second floor. Look behind the curtains and under the sofas." "What will you do, Victor?" Julian asked. "I am going to the bridge." Victor replied. "I need to talk to the captain. He is the only one who can stop this boat. We are in the middle of the ocean. The thief and Mrs. Gable must be on this boat. There is nowhere else to go." The two men hurried away. Victor stood alone in the room for a moment. He looked at the empty nightstand one last time. He felt a cold wind coming from the hallway. The mystery was becoming dangerous. It was no longer just about a missing watch. It was about a missing person. He walked out of the cabin and pulled the door shut. He began the long walk up to the captain's bridge. Victor climbed the narrow metal stairs to the top deck. His legs felt heavy, and his mind was full of questions. He reached the heavy door of the bridge. This was the room where the captain controlled the ship. Victor was about to turn the handle when the world suddenly changed. For the last several hours, there was a constant, deep vibration under his feet. It was the sound and feeling of the powerful engine. Suddenly, that vibration stopped. The silence was immediate and very strange. It felt like the heart of the boat had stopped beating. Without the power of the engine, the Silver Star slowed down. It began to tilt and move with the rhythm of the waves. Victor opened the door and stepped onto the bridge. The room was full of screens and buttons. Most of the screens were dark. The captain was standing at the control panel. He was pressing buttons quickly. His face was red, and he looked very worried. "Captain," Victor said, "I have bad news. Mrs. Gable is missing from her room, and her diamond watch is gone." The captain did not look at him. He continued to pull a heavy metal lever. But nothing happened. "I have my own bad news, Mr. King," the captain replied. His voice was tight and sharp. "The engine just died. I cannot start it again. Someone or something has broken the fuel line." Victor walked closer to the control panel. "Can we call for help? Can we use the radio?" The captain pointed to a large black box with a telephone handle. He picked up the handle and held it out so Victor could hear. There was no sound at all. Usually, there was a soft hiss of electricity, but now there was only a cold, empty silence. "The radio is dead too," the captain said. He sat down in his large chair and put his head in his hands. The wires were cut. This was not an accident. Someone does not want us to talk to the land. Victor looked out of the front windows. The fog was thicker than ever. It was like being inside a giant bowl of grey milk. They were floating in the middle of the ocean. They had no power. They had no way to call the police. And somewhere on the boat, a woman was missing and a thief was hiding. "We are sitting ducks," the captain whispered. "Not yet," Victor said. He stood up straight. He felt the old energy of a detective returning to his bones. "The thief is still here. They cannot leave the boat because there is nowhere to go. We must find them before they do something else." The captain looked up. His eyes were full of fear. "But who can we trust? If the wires were cut, it means the person knows this boat very well. Victor nodded. Exactly. We must go back to the others. We need to stay together. Victor and the captain walked down the metal stairs together. The yacht did not feel like a luxury boat anymore. It felt like a giant, floating cage. Without the sound of the engine, the ocean was very loud. The waves hit the side of the boat with a heavy, wet sound. The fog was still everywhere. It pressed against the windows like a thick grey wall. They entered the main lounge. Julian and Dr. Aries were standing near the glass table. Their faces were pale in the soft light. When the captain told them the news about the engine and the radio, Julian dropped his kitchen towel. "We are trapped?" Julian asked. His voice was high and thin. "In the middle of the sea. With no radio. We must stay calm," Victor said. He looked at each person in the room. He looked at their eyes and their hands. "The person who did this is here. They want us to be afraid. If we are afraid, we make mistakes." Victor walked toward the door that led to the kitchen and the storage rooms. The carpet in this part of the lounge was a very bright, clean white. It was soft and expensive. As he walked, something caught his eye. He stopped near the door of the captain's private office. "What is it, Victor?" Dr. Aries asked. The doctor walked closer. Victor pointed at the floor. On the beautiful white carpet, there was a small mark. It was about the size of a coin. It was a bright, deep red color. Victor knelt down on the floor. He did not touch the mark. He leaned in and looked at it very closely. The red color was very fresh. It was still a little bit wet. It looked like a drop of liquid that fell from above. Is that blood?" Julian whispered. He moved back a few steps. "I am a doctor," Dr. Aries said. He knelt next to Victor. He looked at the red stain for a long time. "It is the right color. But it is very small. It could be many things. It could be red wine. It could be juice from the kitchen." Victor looked up at the door handle of the captain's office. He looked at the walls. He did not see any other marks. He looked back at the red stain. He remembered the muffled cry he heard the night before. He remembered the missing widow and the empty space where the gold watch once sat. "Captain," Victor said, "who has the key to this office?" The captain reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy silver key. "Only I have the key. I locked it last night before I went to the bridge." "Open it," Victor said. The captain's hand shook as he put the key into the lock. He pushed the door open. The office was dark. Victor took a deep breath and stepped inside. He did not know what he would find in the shadows. Victor stepped into the captain's office. The room was small and very neat. There was a large desk made of dark wood and a bookshelf filled with maps of the ocean. He looked around the floor and the furniture. Everything was in its place. There was no sign of a struggle, and Mrs. Gable was not there. "There is nothing here," the captain said. He sounded relieved. "My office is safe." Victor did not look relieved. He walked back to the doorway and pointed at the red stain on the white carpet again. He looked at Julian. The chef was still standing several feet away. He was rubbing his hands together. He looked very nervous. "Julian," Victor said in a calm, steady voice, "you are the chef on this boat. You spend all your time with food and drink. Tell me about this stain." Julian walked forward slowly. He knelt down and looked at the red mark. He did not touch it. He took a deep breath. "Oh, this," he said. His voice was a little bit higher than usual. "I know what this is. This is not blood, Mr. King. It is just strawberry juice." Victor tilted his head. "Strawberry juice? Why is there strawberry juice outside the captain's office at midnight?" Julian looked up at Victor. Last night, after dinner, I was carrying a tray of desserts to the lounge. We had fresh strawberries and cream. The boat moved suddenly because of a large wave. I bumped into the wall right here. A little bit of juice must have dropped from the bowl. Dr. Aries moved closer. He looked at the stain and then at Julian. I saw the desserts last night. The doctor said. They did look very red. But why didn't you clean it up? Julian. You are usually very careful. Julian laughed. But the sound was short and dry. It was dark. And I was tired. I thought I wiped it all away with my towel. I must have missed this small spot. It is a simple mistake. Victor looked at Julian's white apron. It was perfectly clean. Then he looked at Julian's hands. The chef's fingers were shaking. Victor was an expert at reading people. He knew that people often told small lies to hide big secrets. Did you hear anything strange last night, Julian? Victor asked. Perhaps when you were in the kitchen. No. Julian replied quickly. The kitchen is at the back of the boat. The fans are very loud there. I only heard the sound of the wind and the water. I did not hear any cries. I did not see Mrs. Gable. Victor nodded slowly. He did not say if he believed the story about the strawberry juice. He looked at the red stain one more time. In the dim light of the hallway, it looked very dark. It did not look like juice to him. Thank you, Julian. Victor said. You can go back to the kitchen now. But please, do not clean this stain yet. I want to look at it again when the sun is higher. Julian nodded and hurried away. Victor watched him go. The mystery was growing. Was it juice, or was it something more dangerous? Victor knew he needed more evidence before he could be sure. Victor went back down the stairs to Mrs. Gable's cabin. He felt that he had missed something important during his first search. The room was still cold and messy. The tipped-over chair lay on the floor like a broken toy. Victor stood in the center of the room and closed his eyes. He tried to imagine what happened the night before. He walked to the small desk near the window. It was made of heavy, dark wood. He opened the top drawers. They were full of normal things, a hairbrush, some pens, and a few letters from a bank. Victor pulled the drawers out completely and looked behind them. But he found nothing. Then, he moved his hands along the bottom of the desk. He felt the wood carefully with his fingers. Near the back corner, he felt a small, round bump. It was a secret button. Victor pressed it. A small, thin drawer popped open. It was hidden so well that no one would see it normally. Inside the secret drawer, there was only one thing. It was an old photograph. The edges of the paper were yellow and curled. Victor picked it up and held it under the light of the desk lamp. The photograph showed 3 people standing in front of a large building. One person was a young Mrs. Gable. She looked very happy and was wearing a bright summer dress. Next to her stood a tall man with a kind face. Victor guessed this was her husband. But it was the third person who surprised him. The third person in the photo was a man in a sailor's uniform. He was much younger, but he had a very familiar face. He had the same sharp nose and the same dark eyes as someone on the boat. Victor looked closely. It was the captain. Victor turned the photograph over. There was a date written in black ink. August 1998. Below the date, there was a short sentence. A day to remember. We will always be friends. Victor felt a chill. The captain had said he did not know the guests well. He had acted like a stranger to Mrs. Gable. But this photograph proved he was lying. They were friends many years ago. Why did the captain hide the truth? Victor put the photograph in his pocket. He realized that everyone on the Silver Star was linked by a secret past. The invitation was not a mistake. The host had brought these specific people together for a reason. He heard a soft step in the hallway outside the room. Victor turned off the desk lamp and stood very still in the dark. He watched the door. Was the person in the hallway the thief? Or were they just another guest looking for answers? The silence of the boat was heavy, and the mystery of the Silver Star was getting deeper with every step. Victor waited in the dark room for a few seconds. The footsteps in the hallway stopped outside the door. Then, they slowly moved away. Victor opened the door and stepped out. He saw Dr. Aries walking toward the stairs. The doctor was moving quickly, and he looked over his shoulder twice. Victor followed him quietly. He noticed that Dr. Aries was holding his black medical bag with both hands. He held it against his chest as if it were a precious baby. The doctor's knuckles were white because he was gripping the leather handle so hard. "Doctor!" Victor called out. Dr. Aries jumped. He turned around fast. His glasses almost fell off his nose. He looked at Victor with wide, frightened eyes. He pulled the bag even closer to his body. "Oh, Mr. King, you surprised me," the doctor said. He tried to breathe slowly, but his chest moved up and down rapidly. I was going to the lounge to find some water." "You are holding your bag very tightly, Doctor," Victor said. He walked closer until he was only 2 feet away. "Is there something important inside? Perhaps something that could help us find Mrs. Gable?" The doctor shook his head. "No. It is just my medicine. My tools. A doctor never leaves his bag. It is a habit." Victor looked at the bag. It was made of thick, old leather. It looked very heavy. Usually, a medical bag contains light things like bandages or a stethoscope. This bag seemed to pull the doctor's shoulders down with its weight. "The situation on this boat is very strange, Dr. Aries," Victor said in a low, serious voice. "A woman is missing. A thief is here. We must trust each other. Please, open the bag. Let me see what is inside. If it is only medicine, I will not bother you again." The doctor's face turned a dusty red color. He stepped back until his back hit the wooden wall of the hallway. "No," he said firmly. "I cannot do that. A doctor's bag is private. There are records of patients. There are dangerous medicines. I am a professional man. You have no right to ask me this. I'm trying to save a life." Victor replied. "Mrs. Gable might be hurt. If you are hiding something, you are putting us all in danger." "I am hiding nothing," the doctor shouted. His voice echoed in the silent hallway. Then, he seemed to realize he was being too loud. He lowered his voice to a whisper. "Please, leave me alone. Mr. King, I am going to my room." Dr. Aries turned around and walked away as fast as he could. He did not go to the lounge for water. He went straight to his cabin and locked the door. Victor heard the sound of the metal bolt sliding into place. Victor stood alone in the hallway. He looked at the closed door. Why was the doctor so afraid? Why was the bag so heavy? First the captain, and now the doctor. Everyone had something to hide. Victor took the old photograph out of his pocket and looked at the captain's young face. The Silver Star was full of lies. Victor walked back up to the top deck. The cold wind was still blowing. The fog was very thick now. It felt like a heavy, wet blanket. He could not see the water at all. The Silver Star was floating slowly in the silence. Without the engine, the boat felt very small in the big ocean. He found the captain on the bridge. The captain was standing by the window. He looked very old and very tired. His shoulders were slumped. He was looking into the grey mist, hoping to see another boat. "Captain," Victor said. The doctor is hiding something in his bag. He will not let me see inside. The captain turned around. He did not seem surprised. Everyone has secrets on this boat, Mr. King. But right now, secrets are not my biggest problem. We need help. If we stay here, we will drift into the rocks or get lost in the deep sea. What is the plan? Victor asked. The radio is dead. The captain explained. But we have a flare gun. It is an emergency tool. It fires a very bright red light into the sky. The light is so bright that people can see it from many miles away. Even in this fog, a ship might see the red glow and come to save us. The captain walked to a small, orange metal box on the wall. The box had a lock on it. Above the box, there was a sign that said, "Emergency only." The captain reached into his pocket and pulled out his ring of keys. He found the small silver key and put it into the lock. He turned the key. There was a sharp, metallic sound as the lock opened. The captain pulled the door of the orange box. He stopped. He did not move for a long time. Victor walked closer and looked over the captain's shoulder. The inside of the box was painted bright white. There were 3 small foam shapes where the flare gun and the red flares were supposed to sit. But the foam shapes were empty. There was no gun. There were no flares. There was nothing but a small piece of dust. It is gone. The captain whispered. His voice was shaking. Someone took the flare gun. Victor looked at the empty box. This was the 3rd thing that was gone. First the diamond watch, then the widow, and now their only way to call for help. The thief was very clever. They did not just want to steal jewelry. They wanted to make sure the guests were completely alone. Who knew the gun was here? Victor asked. Everyone. The captain replied. He leaned against the wall. Every guest sees the safety boxes when they arrive. It is the law. But only I have the key. Victor looked at the lock. There were no scratches on the metal. The person did not break the lock. Captain. They used a key. Or they are very good at opening locks without one. The captain looked at Victor with wide, terrified eyes. We are truly trapped now. Mr. King. No radio, no engine, and no signal. We are alone in the fog with a criminal. Victor left the captain on the bridge and walked down to the kitchen. He needed to talk to Julian. The kitchen was a narrow room with many silver pots and pans. Usually, it was a warm and busy place, but now it felt cold. The large stove was off because there was no power. The only light came from a small battery lamp on the counter. When Victor entered, he saw Julian sitting on a small wooden stool. The chef was not cooking. He was staring at a piece of white paper on the kitchen table. His face was very white, and his hands were over his mouth. He looked like he had seen a ghost. Julian. What happened? Victor asked. He walked closer to the table. Julian did not look up. He pointed at the paper with a shaking finger. I went to get some bread for lunch. He whispered. The bread box was closed. When I opened it, this was sitting right on top of the loaf. It was not there this morning. I am sure of it. Victor picked up the paper. It was a small, clean square. It was not written by hand. The letters were typed, perhaps by an old typewriter or a small printer. The message was short and very scary. Stay in your room if you want to live. Victor looked at the paper carefully. There was no name and no date. The ink was dark and dry. He turned the paper over, but the back was empty. He looked around the kitchen. There were 2 doors. One led to the dining room, and the other led to a small storage room for vegetables. Did you see anyone come in here? Victor asked. No. Julian said. He stood up and began to pace back and forth in the small space. I was in the dining room for a few minutes to clean the table. The kitchen was empty. Someone must have walked in very quickly and left the note. Victor felt a cold shiver. The person who wrote this note was watching them. They knew when the kitchen was empty. They were moving around the boat like a shadow. This is a warning, Victor said. He put the note in his pocket next to the old photograph. The thief does not want us to search the boat. They want us to hide in our cabins so they can finish their plan. But what is the plan? Julian cried. They already have the watch. They already have Mrs. Gable. Why are they still here? Why are they threatening us? I don't know yet, Victor replied. He looked at the silver pans hanging from the ceiling. They moved slowly as the boat tipped in the waves. But this note tells me one thing. The thief is afraid of us. They want us to stay away. That means we are getting close to the truth. Julian did not look brave. He looked like he wanted to lock himself in a cupboard. I'm going to my room, Mr. King. I'm going to lock the door and I'm not coming out. I don't care about the lunch or the dinner. Victor watched the chef leave the kitchen. He was now alone in the dark room. He looked at the bread box. The mystery was no longer about a stolen watch. It was a battle of nerves. Victor walked out of the kitchen and back up the stairs. The boat moved slowly. Without the engine, it felt like a leaf on a large, dark pond. He returned to the bridge. He wanted to see if the captain had found any way to fix the radio. When he entered the bridge, the captain was not there. The room was empty. The screens were still dark. The only light came from the grey sky outside the windows. Victor walked to the center of the room. He looked at the main navigation table. This was where the captain kept the maps and the large, silver compass. Victor stopped. He saw a pile of broken glass on the floor. He looked at the compass. It was a beautiful, old instrument made of brass and glass. But now, it was a mess. The glass cover was smashed into tiny pieces. The long, thin needle was bent in half. Victor looked down at the floor. Next to the navigation table, there was a heavy metal wrench. It was a long, cold tool used for fixing pipes. It was covered in a little bit of oil. Someone had used this wrench to hit the compass with great force. They do not want us to know where we are, Victor whispered to himself. Now, the sabotage was complete. The Silver Star had no engine to move. It had no radio to call for help. It had no flare gun to signal other ships. And now, it had no compass to show the direction. They were not just trapped. They were lost. They were drifting in the fog, and they did not know if they were moving toward the land or deeper into the empty ocean. The captain walked into the room a moment later. He was carrying a small flashlight. When the light hit the broken compass, the captain let out a long, low breath. He looked like he wanted to cry. "My compass," the captain said. He walked to the table and touched the broken metal with his fingers. "My father gave this to me. It worked for 40 years. Why would someone do this?" "Because they are playing a game," Victor said. He picked up the heavy wrench using his handkerchief. He did not want to touch it with his bare hands. They want us to feel helpless. A man who is lost is a man who is easy to scare. "But we are lost," the captain replied. He looked out at the fog. "The wind is moving us, but I don't know where. There are rocks near the coast. If we hit them, the boat will sink in minutes." Victor looked at the wrench. It was a common tool. The captain had tools. Julian had tools in the kitchen. Even the doctor might have a wrench in his bag. It did not tell him who the thief was, but it told him that the thief was very angry. They were not just stealing. They were destroying the boat. Victor put the wrench on a chair. He felt a new sense of urgency. The mystery was now a race against time. If he did not find the thief soon, The Silver Star might never reach the harbor again. Victor went to his cabin, but his mind was too busy to sleep. He sat on his small bed and looked at the items on his lap. He had the old photograph of the captain and the threatening note from the kitchen. The words "stay in your room" were stuck in his head. But Victor was a detective. He did not like to follow the rules of criminals. He put on his heavy coat and walked quietly to his door. He did not turn on the lights in the hallway. He moved like a shadow up the stairs and out onto the deck. The night was very dark. The fog was wet and cold against his skin. The yacht was tilting slowly from side to side because the engine was not running to keep it steady. He walked to the back of the boat. This was the area where the small lifeboats were kept. He looked at the orange boats. They were all there, covered in thick plastic. He counted them carefully. 1, 2, 3. They were all in their places. This was a relief, but he still felt that something was wrong. Victor walked to the railing and looked down at the black water. The ocean was deep and scary at night. He watched the white foam of the waves hitting the side of the ship. Suddenly, he saw something strange. About 20 feet away from the side of the Silver Star, there was a dark shape in the water. It was not a wave. Waves were long and had white tops. This shape was round and very dark. It did not move with the rhythm of the ocean. It seemed to be moving away from the yacht, heading deeper into the fog. Is that a person? Victor whispered to himself. He leaned further over the metal railing. He squinted his eyes to see better through the mist. The shape was small. It looked like a person sitting in a small, black rubber boat. There was no light on the shape. There was no sound of an engine. It was just a dark shadow moving slowly through the grey world. Victor looked around the deck for a flashlight. He found one near a storage box, but he did not turn it on. He knew that if he used the light, the person in the water would see him. He wanted to watch silently. The dark shape moved further and further away. For a second, the fog lifted just a little bit. Victor saw a quick flash of something white on the shape. It looked like a white sleeve or a white towel. Then, the fog closed again. The shape disappeared into the night. Victor stood there for a long time. His heart was beating very fast. Who was in the water? Was it the thief leaving the boat? Was it Mrs. Gable? Or was it someone coming from another ship? He looked at the empty ocean and felt a great sense of danger. The Silver Star was not as alone as he thought. He went back inside, but he did not go to bed. He sat in the dark lounge and watched the stairs. Victor sat in the dark lounge until the first light of morning appeared. The sky did not turn blue. It turned a light, ghostly grey. His eyes were heavy, but he did not close them. He kept thinking about the dark shape in the water. Was it the doctor? Was it the chef? He needed to know who was still on the boat. At 7 o'clock, Victor stood up. His bones felt stiff from the cold. He walked down the stairs to the guest cabins. He wanted to speak with Dr. Aries again. He wanted to demand that the doctor open his black bag. The secrets were becoming too dangerous to keep. When he reached the doctor's door, Victor stopped. Last night, he heard the doctor lock the door with a heavy metal bolt. But now, the door was not locked. It was open a few inches. A cold draft of air came from inside the room. Dr. Aries. Victor called out. He pushed the door open slowly. The cabin was silent. The bed was neat, but it did not look like anyone had slept in it. Victor walked to the small wooden table where the doctor usually kept his heavy black medical bag. The table was empty. There was nothing there but a few white dust marks. Victor looked around the room. He checked the closet, but the doctor's brown suit and his shoes were gone. He looked in the small bathroom. It was empty and dry. Then, Victor saw something on the floor near the bed. He knelt down and picked it up. It was a pair of glasses. They had thin silver frames. One of the glass lenses was cracked. Victor knew these glasses very well. Dr. Aries wore them every day. He could not see anything without them. He would not leave his glasses. Victor whispered. Not if he wanted to go somewhere. Victor felt a cold pit in his stomach. First, Mrs. Gable disappeared. Now, the doctor was gone too. And the doctor had taken his mysterious, heavy bag with him. Or someone had taken it for him. He walked back into the hallway. He felt the weight of the silence on the Silver Star. The yacht was large, but it was starting to feel very empty. Only Victor, the captain, and Julian the chef were left. Or were they? He remembered the dark shape in the water from the night before. He ran up the stairs to find the captain. He needed to tell him that another guest was gone. Every hour, the group was getting smaller. Victor was a detective, but he felt like a hunter who was now being hunted. He reached the top of the stairs and looked toward the bridge. The fog was so thick he could barely see his own hands. He was alone in a grey world. Victor walked through the main lounge. The air was very quiet. He was looking for the captain. He needed to tell him about the disappearance of Dr. Aries. As he walked toward the front of the boat, he stopped. He looked at the floor. The red carpet was different here. It was dark and heavy with water. He knelt down. There were wet footprints on the carpet. They were very large. The water was fresh and cold. It was not from a small spill in the kitchen. It was from the sea. These footprints started at the heavy glass door that led to the outside deck. Someone had come inside from the fog and the rain. Victor followed the trail. The prints were messy. The person was moving fast. They went past the dining room and the small library. Victor felt his heart beat against his ribs. He stayed very close to the wall. He did not want to make a sound. He looked at his own shoes. They were dry. He was not the person making the marks. The trail of water led directly to the captain's private office. Victor stood in front of the wooden door. The footprints stopped right there. A small pool of water was forming on the floor. It was dripping from the bottom of the door. Victor remembered what the captain said earlier. Only I have the key. But the captain was supposed to be up on the bridge. Why would he come down here and leave such a messy trail of water? Or was it someone else? Was it the person Victor saw in the small black boat? Victor reached for the door handle. It was wet and cold. He felt the metal under his fingers. He did not turn it yet. He leaned his head against the wood. He listened with all his strength. Inside the office, he heard a soft, scraping sound. It sounded like someone was pulling a heavy box across the floor. It was a slow, difficult sound. The person inside was busy. They were moving something heavy. Victor thought about the missing doctor and the widow. He thought about the stolen watch. Was the treasure inside this room? Victor took a deep breath. He knew he had to open the door, but he was afraid of what he might see. The person inside was wet and very quiet. Victor turned the handle slowly. He did not want the door to make any noise. He pushed the door open just a little bit. He looked into the shadows of the captain's room. A cold wind blew past him, and he saw a dark figure standing by the desk. Victor pushed the door open the rest of the way. The room was illuminated only by the grey, ghostly light filtering through the porthole. Standing by the desk was the captain. He was a sight that made Victor freeze. The man was soaking wet from head to toe. Water pooled around his heavy boots, and his dark blue uniform was several shades darker from the sea. He was shivering, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. In his hands, the captain held a piece of thick, yellowed paper. It looked like an old sea chart, but it was covered in fresh, wet smudges. "Captain?" Victor asked. his voice low and cautious. "What happened to you? Why are you dripping with seawater?" The captain jumped, nearly dropping the paper. He turned to face Victor, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He didn't look like a man in charge. He looked like a man who had just seen the bottom of the ocean. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at the paper in his hands and tried to hide it behind his back. But Victor had already seen it. I had to check the exterior." The captain stammered. "The hull. I thought I heard something hitting the side of the boat. I went out on the lower ledge. A wave, it caught me." Victor didn't move. "The sea is calm, Captain. There are no waves large enough to soak a man like that unless he goes looking for them. And what is that in your hand?" The captain sighed, his shoulders dropping. The fight seemed to leave him. He slowly brought the paper forward and laid it flat on the desk. Victor stepped closer. It was indeed a map of the local coastline. But it was not a standard navigation chart. There were several red X marks drawn at different points in the water, far away from the usual shipping lanes. One of the marks was circled twice. "I found this in my locker this morning," the captain whispered. "It was tucked inside my spare jacket. I didn't put it there, Victor. I swear it." "Then why are you wet?" Victor pressed, pointing to the trail of water leading from the deck. "Because the circled mark, it's where we are right now," the captain said, his voice trembling. "I went to the railing to see if there was a buoy or a marker in the water. I saw something floating, a black crate. I tried to reach for it, but I slipped. I nearly went over the side." Victor looked at the X marks. They didn't look like locations for safety equipment or treasure. They looked like a path through the fog that someone had planned long before the Silver Star left the pier. "Is this why you knew Mrs. Gable's husband?" Victor asked, pulling the old photograph from his pocket. The captain looked at the photo and closed his eyes. "We were friends. Yes. But that was a long time ago. I haven't seen her in years until she stepped onto this boat. I didn't tell you because I was ashamed. I'm losing my ship. Victor. I'm in debt. I thought this voyage would save me." Victor looked from the wet map to the desperate man. The puzzle was missing pieces, but the picture was starting to form. The captain was a victim, a liar, or perhaps both. The plot thickens. Just when Victor thought he had a handle on the guest list, a new player enters the game. The captain was still shivering in his wet uniform when a sudden, sharp sound echoed from the main lounge. It was the sound of a book being closed, hard. Victor and the captain exchanged a quick, worried glance. They hadn't heard anyone enter the lounge, and with the engine silent, every sound on the Silver Star should have been obvious. Victor moved first, stepping out of the office and into the lounge. Sitting in one of the plush blue chairs, perfectly dry and looking quite bored, was a man Victor had never seen before. He was thin, with sharp features and hair slicked back with too much gel. He wore a crisp, dark grey suit that looked far too formal for a sea voyage. "It took you long enough to find me," the man said. His voice was like sandpaper, dry and grating. "Who are you?" Victor demanded, his hand instinctively reaching for the notebook in his pocket. "And where did you come from? You weren't at dinner." The man stood up slowly, adjusting his silk tie. "My name is Silas Vance. I am a lawyer. I represent the Gable estate, specifically, the interests of the late Mr. Gable." He looked at the captain's wet boots with a look of pure disgust. "I have been in the VIP suite on the lower deck. It's a private cabin, separate from the others. My instructions were to remain out of sight until the appropriate time." Victor's eyes narrowed. "And when is the appropriate time?" "Now," Vance replied. He pulled a silver cigarette case from his pocket but didn't open it. "I heard the engine stop. I heard the shouting. And I know that Mrs. Gable, my client, has gone missing. This is a gross display of negligence. Captain. The captain stepped forward, still dripping. I didn't even know you were on my manifest. Vance. Who let you on this boat? Vance offered a cold, thin smile. The same person who invited Mr. King here. Our friend. But unlike the rest of you, I am here to ensure that the gold watch and the other Gable assets are handled according to the law. Victor stepped between the two men. He noticed something about the lawyer. While the captain was soaked and the doctor was missing, Silas Vance was perfectly composed. Not a hair was out of place. Observation 1. Vance knew about the watch. Observation 2. He claimed to be in a private suite Victor hadn't noticed. Observation 3. He showed no concern for Mrs. Gable's safety, only her assets. If you're her lawyer, Victor said, then you should be the most worried of all. She didn't just walk away. She was taken. And Dr. Aries is gone, too. Vance didn't blink. The doctor was a fool. But Mrs. Gable, she is a woman of many secrets. Perhaps she didn't want to be found by you, Mr. King. Victor felt a surge of frustration. Every time he found a clue, a new mystery appeared to block his path. Silas Vance wasn't just a guest. He was a complication Victor hadn't prepared for. Victor left the lounge, leaving the shivering captain and the icy Silas Vance to stare at each other. He needed air, cold, honest air, to clear the fog in his brain. The presence of a secret lawyer changed everything. If Vance was telling the truth, there were parts of the Silver Star Victor hadn't even seen yet. He walked out onto the starboard deck, heading toward the spot where the captain claimed to have slipped. The wood was still slick with mist, making every step a gamble. Victor reached the railing and looked down. The water was a churning black soup, but he wasn't looking at the waves. He was looking at the white-painted wood of the deck. There, right near the edge of the railing, was the mark. It wasn't a footprint or a bloodstain. It was a deep, jagged scrape in the wood, about 6 inches long. The white paint had been gouged away, revealing the dark timber beneath. Victor knelt, ignoring the dampness seeping into his trousers. He ran his fingers over the wound in the wood. This wasn't made by a man slipping. Victor muttered. The scrape was fresh. He could still see tiny curls of white paint resting near the edge. It was deep and angled downward, as if something heavy and metallic had been hooked over the side of the boat and pulled with immense force. Beside the scrape, Victor noticed a faint, oily residue. He leaned in and sniffed. It didn't smell like the yacht's engine oil. It had a sharper, chemical scent, like the fuel used for outboard motors on small speedboats. Victor's mind raced back to the dark shape he had seen in the water the night before. If that shape was a small boat, it hadn't just been drifting. It had been tethered here. He wasn't checking the hull. Victor realized. He was helping someone on or off the ship. But who? The captain was soaked, meaning he'd been close to the water, but the scrape suggested a heavy object. Perhaps the missing black suitcase or the doctor's heavy bag had been lowered down. As he stood up, Victor noticed one more thing. Caught in a splinter of the jagged wood was a small piece of fabric. He carefully pulled it free. It was a tiny thread of bright green silk. Victor frowned. Mrs. Gable wore black. The doctor wore brown. The captain wore blue. Julian wore white. And the lawyer, Vance, was in grey. None of the guests were wearing green. He tucked the green thread into his notebook. The Silver Star was no longer just a scene of a disappearance. It was a transit point. Someone else had been on this boat, or someone was hiding a very colourful secret. Victor left the chilly deck and headed straight for the kitchen. The green thread burned a hole in his pocket. It was a colour that didn't belong on this boat. He found the kitchen empty. Julian was nowhere to be seen. likely hiding in his cabin as he had promised. The room smelled of stale coffee and cold grease. Victor walked to the spot where the strawberry juice had stained the carpet just outside the door. He knelt again, looking at the angle of the spill. If Julian had bumped into the wall while carrying a tray, the spray should have hit the wall first. But the wall was clean. The drop had come from straight above. He looked up at the ceiling. There was a small, circular vent for the air conditioning, but nothing else. He stepped into the kitchen itself, his eyes scanning the silver surfaces. Victor began to move through the kitchen with the practiced ease of a man who had searched 1,000 rooms. He checked the walk-in fridge, locked, the oven, cold, and the cupboards, full of expensive china. Finally, he reached the back of the pantry, where large sacks of flour and sugar were stacked against the hull. He noticed something odd about the floorboards here. While the rest of the kitchen floor was made of easy-to-clean linoleum, the area behind the flour sacks was solid oak. Observation 1. The flour sacks were dusty, but there were finger marks in the dust on the sides, as if they had been moved recently. Observation 2. There was a faint scratch on the oak floor, forming a perfect arc. Observation 3. A tiny, familiar scent lingered here, not of food, but of the chemical fuel he had smelled on the deck. Victor braced his shoulder against the heavy sacks of flour and pushed. With a low, rhythmic groan, the pallet shifted. Behind it, built into the very wood of the wall, was a narrow, handleless door. There was no keyhole. Instead, there was a small, recessed wooden panel. Victor pressed it. With a hydraulic hiss, the door clicked open. It didn't lead to a closet. It led to a dark, narrow ladder descending into the belly of the ship. A luxury yacht always has secrets. Victor whispered to the empty room. But usually, they are for the servants, not for ghosts. He pulled a small penlight from his pocket and shone it down. The ladder was made of cold steel. At the bottom, he could see a small, cramped space filled with pipes and humming machinery, the service crawl space. And there, caught on the top rung of the metal ladder, was another piece of evidence, a second thread of bright green silk. Someone had been using this hidden door to move between the decks without being seen in the hallways. Julian had lied about the juice. The captain had lied about the map. And now, Victor was looking into the literal underworld of the Silver Star. Victor climbed down the cold steel ladder, his penlight cutting a narrow path through the darkness. The air here was heavy and smelled of diesel and old grease. This was the skeleton of the Silver Star, far beneath the polished wood and red carpets of the guest levels. At the bottom of the ladder, he found himself in a narrow maintenance corridor. To his left were the silent, massive engines. To his right was a small, heavy door marked with a brass plate. Private storage. Authorized personnel only. The door was slightly ajar. Victor pushed it open with the toe of his shoe. Inside was a small, windowless room that looked more like an office than a storage closet. There was a single chair, a small desk, and a large, built-in wall safe. Victor's eyes went immediately to the safe. The heavy circular door was standing wide open, its thick steel bolts extended into empty air. The safe. It was large enough to hold a small suitcase. The interior. Completely empty, except for a fine layer of white dust on the bottom. The lock. A high-tech digital keypad that had been physically smashed. Someone had used a heavy tool, perhaps the wrench Victor found earlier, to break the electronics. Victor leaned in to inspect the interior of the safe. He noticed a small, rectangular shape in the dust at the very back. He reached in and pulled out a single, heavy card. It was the same gold-bordered invitation he had received, but this one had a name written on the back in thick, black ink. For the doctor. Below the name, there was a handwritten note. The price of silence is higher than the price of the watch. Bring the bag. Victor felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift. This safe hadn't held the gold watch. It had held something else, something belonging to Dr. Aries. The doctor hadn't just been a guest. He had been part of a transaction. He wasn't on vacation. Victor whispered. He was making a delivery. Suddenly, the floor beneath Victor's feet vibrated. It wasn't the engine starting. It was a heavy, thumping sound coming from the ceiling directly above him, the floor of the kitchen. Someone was moving the flour sacks back into place, locking Victor inside the crawl space. Victor was trapped in the dark. But he wasn't alone. He could hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the pipes. The friend was no longer just a host. They were a jailer. Victor stood in the dim light of his penlight, the heavy thud of the flour sacks sealing him into the belly of the ship. He was trapped. But he didn't panic. A detective knows that every cage has a key, and every room has a secret. He turned his attention back to the small desk in the private storage room. If the safe had been emptied, perhaps the thief had overlooked something smaller. He pulled the single drawer open. It was empty. He ran his hand along the back of the drawer's frame and felt a familiar texture. Not wood, but smooth, cold leather. Taped to the underside of the desk was a small, blue leather-bound book. Victor peeled the diary away from the desk. The cover was worn, and the initials E.G. Eleanor Gable were stamped in faded silver on the corner. He flipped it open to the most recent pages. The handwriting was elegant but shaky, as if written by a woman whose hands were trembling with fear. October 14th. The invitations have arrived. He calls himself a friend. But I know that handwriting. It is the same hand that wrote the threats to my husband 20 years ago. He knows about the Silver Star. He knows about the cargo we never reported. October 20th. I cannot tell the doctor. He thinks this is a simple reunion. He doesn't realize he was invited because of what his father did. We are all guilty, and now the sea is calling for its debt. Victor's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't a random robbery. This was an organized trap. Mrs. Gable hadn't been an innocent victim. She was a participant in a crime that happened decades ago. The cargo she mentioned, it couldn't just be the watch. He turned to the very last page, dated only 3 days ago. The lawyer, Vance, is coming too. I don't trust him. He says he wants to protect the estate, but I think he wants the ledger. If they find the ledger, they find the names of everyone involved in the 1998 heist. I must hide it. Victor looked around the small, cramped room. A ledger. A list of names. This was the real treasure of the Silver Star. The gold watch was a distraction, a glittering toy to keep the guests' eyes busy while the real work was done in the shadows. Suddenly, a high-pitched, metallic scratching sound filled the room. It was coming from the air conditioning vent in the corner. Victor froze, his penlight dying as the battery finally gave out. In the total darkness, he heard a voice, a raspy, distorted whisper, echoing through the ventilation pipes. You shouldn't have come down here. Victor. Some secrets are better left at the bottom of the ocean. The sound of a heavy bolt sliding into place echoed from the other side of the storage room door. He wasn't just trapped. He was being locked in from the outside. Victor was alone in a darkness so thick it felt like a physical weight against his chest. The voice in the ventilation had been cold and distorted, but it carried a message that was crystal clear. He had found something he wasn't supposed to see. He reached out into the void, his fingers brushing against the cold, oily floor of the storage room. He needed light, and he needed it before the friend decided to do more than just lock the door. His hand struck something heavy and metallic. It rolled away with a hollow clink. Victor crawled toward the sound. His fingers closed around the handle of an old-fashioned brass lantern. He shook it. There was a faint splash of liquid inside. The glass casing was shattered, leaving sharp, jagged edges, but the wick was still there. He searched his pockets and found a small box of matches he had taken from the dining room earlier. He struck one. The small, orange flame danced in the dark, reflecting off the oily walls. The lantern. Old, rusted, but functional. The match. A flickering, temporary ally. The clue. In the brief glow, Victor saw that the private storage room wasn't just a room. It was a junction. He lit the wick. The lantern sputtered to life, casting long, jumping shadows. The lack of glass meant the flame was vulnerable to the slightest draft, but it gave him enough light to see the ceiling. Directly above the desk where he had found the diary was a maintenance hatch. It wasn't bolted. It was held in place by 4 heavy screws. Victor looked at his silver pocket knife. It was a gift from his retirement party, and he had never used it for more than peeling apples. He opened the small screwdriver tool. "Well," Victor muttered, his voice echoing in the small space. "Time to see if the police department's retirement gifts are actually useful." He stood on the desk, the lantern hanging from a hook nearby. One by one, he turned the screws. They were rusted and stubborn, screaming as they turned against the metal. With the final turn, the hatch loosened. He pushed it upward, and a rush of cold, salty air hit his face. He pulled himself up into a narrow crawl space that ran between the ship's inner hull and the guest deck. As he moved through the tight space, the light of his lantern illuminated something caught in the wiring of the ship's electrical system. It was a small, black electronic box with a blinking red light. It was attached directly to the main power lines. Victor realized then that the engine failure hadn't been a mechanical breakdown. This device was a remote jammer. Someone was controlling the Silver Star from a distance, or from right here on the boat. He reached out to touch the box, but a sudden, violent lurch of the ship threw him against the metal wall. The lantern fell, the flame extinguished instantly, leaving him in total darkness once again. The lurch of the ship was violent, the kind that suggested the Silver Star had either struck something or been hit by a massive, rogue wave. In the suffocating darkness of the crawl space, Victor felt the cold metal of the hull groan. He waited, heart hammering against his ribs, until the yacht settled into a heavy, rhythmic roll. He fumbled for his matches. The first 2 snapped in his trembling fingers. The third flared, a tiny spark of defiance. He didn't relit the lantern. The broken glass made it too dangerous in this cramped space. Instead, he used the match to find the latch of the maintenance door he had been heading toward. Victor emerged from the crawl space into the engine room. It was a cathedral of silent machinery, smelling of hot copper and stale diesel. The emergency lights, faint, red glowing orbs, cast long, hellish shadows across the floor. There, hanging from a heavy brass pipe near the primary fuel intake, was a dark brown suit jacket. It looked ghostly, swaying back and forth with the motion of the boat. Victor recognized it immediately. It was the jacket Dr. Aries had been wearing when he first boarded. He approached it cautiously, his shoes clicking on the metal grating. Condition. The coat was perfectly dry, which was strange given the captain was soaking wet. Position. It was hung neatly, as if the doctor had simply stepped out for a moment and intended to return. The pocket. A rectangular bulge was visible in the right-hand pocket. Victor reached into the pocket. He didn't find a medical tool or a wallet. He pulled out a small, silver key attached to a plastic tag that read, Locker 14, Pier 47. Beside the key was a folded prescription slip. Victor smoothed it out. It wasn't a list of medicines. It was a list of names. The same names Mrs. Gable's diary had hinted at. At the very top of the list, written in aggressive red ink, was a name that made Victor's blood run cold. Captain Elias Thorne. Below it, in smaller letters, the weight of the gold is equal to the weight of the sin. He wasn't a victim. Victor whispered, looking at the empty coat. The doctor was the record keeper. A sudden metallic clang echoed from the far end of the engine room. Victor ducked behind a massive cooling tank. Through the gaps in the machinery, he saw a pair of boots, clean, polished, and very dry, walking slowly across the grating. The person was heading straight for the hanging coat. Victor realized he was holding the evidence they were looking for. If he stayed here, he would be found. If he ran, he would be heard. Victor barely breathed as the figure in the polished boots stopped beside the hanging coat. A gloved hand reached into the empty pocket, feeling for the key and the list that Victor now held tightly in his own hand. A frustrated grunt, low and metallic, echoed through the engine room. Whoever it was, they were not happy. Victor used the person's frustration as a distraction. He slid through a secondary maintenance pipe, his body aching from the tight squeeze, and climbed a vertical ladder that bypassed the main lounge. He emerged in a small service closet behind the communications room, just a few feet from the bridge. The communications room was a tiny booth filled with the smell of ozone and burnt plastic. Earlier, the captain had shown Victor the dead radio, but Victor hadn't had a chance to inspect the hardware himself. Now, with the silver key and the list of names in his pocket, he looked at the machine with a detective's eye. He pulled the front panel off the radio unit. It didn't take an expert to see the problem. The wires hadn't been cut by a panicked thief. They had been rerouted. The main antenna, disconnected and plugged into a small, battery-powered loop recorder. The frequency dial, soldered into a single position. A private, high-frequency channel not used by the Coast Guard. The sabotage. It was designed to look broken to a layman, but it was actually functioning as a one-way beacon. Victor leaned in, his ear close to the speaker. Beneath the heavy layer of artificial static being played by the loop recorder, he heard a rhythmic pulse. It wasn't a heartbeat. It was a signal pulse. It's a homing beacon. Victor whispered, "We aren't drifting aimlessly. We are being led." He followed the wires to the back of the desk and found a small, handwritten note taped to the underside of the radio's cooling fan. It was written in the same elegant gold ink as the invitations. "The Silver Star always finds its way home. Don't let the detective change the coordinates." Victor realized the friend wasn't just someone on the boat. The friend was someone waiting for them at the end of the pulse. Every minute the engine was off, the current and the beacon were drawing them closer to a specific point in the fog. He heard the heavy door of the bridge open nearby. The captain was talking to someone. Victor stayed low, his hand hovering over the rerouted wires. If he cut them now, the beacon would die, but the friend would know the detective had won this round. Victor retreated from the communications room just as the captain's heavy footsteps crossed the bridge. He slipped into the narrow service hallway that led toward the galley's laundry chute. If the ship was a body, Victor was currently moving through its veins, trying to find the source of the infection. The air in the laundry area was thick with the smell of damp linen and bleach. A large wicker basket sat under the chute, overflowing with the tablecloths and napkins from last night's interrupted dinner. Victor began to sort through the white fabric. Most of it was clean or stained only with wine and gravy. But near the bottom of the basket, tucked inside a folded pillowcase, he found what he was looking for. It was a heavy, white linen napkin, the kind used in the VIP dining room. It was crumpled and damp. When Victor unfolded it, a large, rusty brown stain bloomed across the fabric. This was not strawberry juice. The smell was unmistakable, metallic and sharp. It was blood. A lot of it. The blood wasn't just a spill. There were clear imprints of 4 fingers and a thumb, as if someone had used the napkin to grip a bleeding wound. The handprint was small, too small for the captain or Julian. It matched the delicate frame of Mrs. Gable, or perhaps the thin, skeletal hands of Silas Vance. On the corner of the napkin, there was a smudge of something else, a streak of bright green grease. Victor pulled the green thread from his pocket and held it next to the grease smudge. The colors were an identical, haunting match. Someone was injured, and they were near the machinery. Victor whispered. The green grease was likely marine-grade lubricant, used for the pulleys that operated the lifeboats. If the blood belonged to Mrs. Gable, It meant she hadn't left the boat willingly in a small craft. She had been hurt near the lifeboats, and someone had used this napkin to clean up the mess before hiding it in the laundry. As Victor studied the napkin, he noticed a small, hard object caught in the folds of the linen. He shook the cloth, and a small gold tooth clattered onto the floorboards. Victor stared at the gold. He remembered Dr. Aries smiling during dinner. The doctor had a full set of white teeth. The captain had silver fillings. But Julian, the chef, had a distinctive gold crown on his upper molar. The blood on the napkin might not be the victim's. It might belong to the attacker. Victor pocketed the gold tooth, the metallic weight of it feeling like a grim promise. If Julian was missing a tooth, he had been in a fight. And if he had been in a fight, he wasn't just a simple chef anymore. He was a combatant. Victor bypassed the kitchen and slipped back into the hallway of guest cabins. He returned to Dr. Aris's room. He felt he had been too hasty during his first search. A doctor's room is a pharmacy in miniature, and in a mystery like this, medicine is often just another word for a weapon. The room still smelled of the doctor's heavy cologne, but beneath it was a sharper, more clinical scent. Victor went straight to the small bedside table. He pulled the drawer out completely and flipped it over. Nothing. He checked the U-bend of the sink in the tiny bathroom. Nothing. Finally, he looked at the ventilation grate near the floor. It was slightly loose. Using his pocket knife, he pried it open. Tucked inside the duct was a small, amber glass bottle. Victor held it up to the dim light. The label was partially torn, but the remaining letters were clear. Digitoxin. Concentrated. Digitoxin is a powerful heart medication. In small doses, it saves lives. In high concentrations, it causes the heart to slow down until it simply stops. The bottle was completely empty, with a white, powdery residue clinging to the bottom. The name on the label wasn't Mrs. Gable's. It was prescribed to S. Vance. Victor's mind flashed back to the dinner. He remembered the lawyer, Silas Vance, sitting in the lounge later, looking perfectly dry and composed. He also remembered Julian serving the wine. It wasn't a kidnapping. Victor whispered. It was a sedation. If the digitoxin had been slipped into the wine, it would explain why Mrs. Gable hadn't screamed. She wouldn't have been able to. She would have felt tired, her heart slowing, her limbs becoming heavy as lead. The muffled cry Victor heard wasn't a shout for help. It was the sound of someone falling. Victor realized the doctor might not have been a victim either. If the bottle was in his room, he was the one holding the weapon. But why would the lawyer's name be on the bottle? A sudden, sharp click-clack of high heels echoed in the hallway. This was impossible. There were no women left on the boat, or so Victor thought. He ducked behind the heavy velvet curtains just as the door to the doctor's cabin swung open. Victor held his breath, the heavy velvet of the curtains pressing against his face. The rhythmic click-clack of the heels stopped in the center of the room. Through a tiny gap in the fabric, he watched as a woman in a long black dress and a thick, lace veil moved toward the bedside table. Around her shoulders was a bright green silk shawl, the exact source of the threads Victor had found across the ship. The woman's movements were precise and devoid of the panic Victor had seen in the other guests. She reached for the ventilation grate, her gloved fingers searching the space where the digitoxin bottle had been hidden. When she found it empty, she didn't gasp. She simply stood perfectly still, her head tilting slightly as if she were listening to the heartbeat of the ship. "You can come out now, Mr. King," she said. Her voice was cool, melodic, and entirely familiar. "The dust on the floor shows exactly where you're standing." Victor stepped out from behind the curtain, his hand resting on the notebook in his pocket. "Mrs. Gable, I presume you had a reason for pretending to be missing." The woman reached up and pulled back the veil. It was indeed Eleanor Gable, but the fragile widow Victor had met at dinner was gone. Her eyes were sharp and cold, and she held herself with the authority of a general. There was no sign of injury, though her green shawl was slightly frayed at the edges. In a den of wolves, it is best to let everyone think the sheep has already been eaten, she replied, walking to the porthole to stare out at the grey mist. Victor stood his ground. I found your diary, Eleanor, and I found the bottle of digitoxin prescribed to the lawyer. You weren't kidnapped. You were clearing the board. The missing watch. A trinket. She dismissed. I planted it in Julian's kitchen to see how he would react. He's a greedy man, but not a clever one. The doctor, Dr. Aries, is currently incapacitated. He knew too much about the 1998 cargo. He was going to sell the ledger to Vance. The goal. I didn't invite you here to solve a mystery, Victor. I invited you to be a witness. When the Silver Star reaches its destination, the truth about my husband's death will finally be documented by a man of your reputation. And what about the engine? The radio? The compass? Victor asked, his voice hardening. You've turned this ship into a floating tomb. I had to ensure no one could leave before the friend arrived, she said, her gaze shifting to the dark water outside. And if you look out that window, Mr. King, you'll see that our host is finally here. Victor looked. Emerging through the fog was not a rescue ship, but a long, black silhouette of a vessel with no lights and no flag. It was moving silently toward them, guided by the beacon Victor had found in the communications room. The black vessel didn't use sirens or lights. It moved with the predatory grace of a shark, cutting through the fog until its hull grated against the Silver Star. The impact was a low, bone-shaking groan of metal on metal. Victor and Eleanor Gable stood on the observation deck, watching as magnetic clamps fired from the mysterious ship, locking the two vessels together in a deadly embrace. A bridge was lowered, a high-tech, carbon fiber plank that looked out of place against the aging wood of the yacht. Four figures emerged from the mist on the other side. They weren't pirates or sailors. They were dressed in dark, expensive suits, their faces obscured by the shadows of their umbrellas. In the lead was a man whose presence seemed to suck the warmth out of the air. He walked across the bridge with a slow, rhythmic gait. When he reached the deck of the Silver Star, he paused to brush a speck of sea spray from his sleeve. "You're late, Arthur," Eleanor said, her voice devoid of emotion. The man looked up. His face was a map of cold lines and calculated risks. It was the man from the 1998 photograph, but the kind face Victor had seen was gone, replaced by the hard mask of a man who had spent 20 years in the shadows. This was Arthur Vance, the older brother of the lawyer, Silas, and the man everyone believed had died in the heist decades ago. Arthur was the dead husband's partner. He hadn't come for the watch. He had come for the ledger of sin mentioned in the diary. The Silver Star was never meant to reach a harbor. It was meant to be a meeting point for a final settlement. The fog was thicker than anticipated. "Eleanor," Arthur replied. He turned his gaze to Victor. "And I see you've brought the detective. A bold choice. Does he know he's here to sign a death certificate, not a police report?" Victor stepped forward, his hand tightening on the silver key in his pocket. "The only thing being signed today, Mr. Vance, is a confession. I've seen the safe. I've found the digitoxin. And I know about the cargo from 1998. Arthur laughed, a sound like dry leaves skittering on a grave. "Knowledge is a heavy burden, Mr. King. Especially when the boat you're standing on is currently rigged with enough explosives to vaporize us all if the friend doesn't get what he wants." At that moment, the captain and Silas Vance appeared on the deck. The captain looked horrified, his eyes darting to the magnetic clamps. Silas, however, looked triumphant. He walked over to stand beside his brother. "The ledger, Eleanor," Arthur said, holding out a gloved hand. "Give it to me. and the detective might actually live to see the sunrise. The fog seemed to tighten its grip on the Silver Star as the two Vance brothers stood together, one a lawyer of the law, the other a lord of the shadows. The captain trembled, and Eleanor Gable stood like a statue of black marble. Victor King stepped into the center of the deck, the cold wind whipping his coat. He felt the weight of the silver key in his pocket and the truth in his mind. "You talk a lot about burdens, Arthur," Victor said, his voice cutting through the damp air like a blade. "But you've made a classic mistake. You assumed that because the engine stopped, the detective stopped too." Arthur Vance curled a lip. "You have nothing, King. You're a retired policeman on a sinking boat. Give me the ledger." "The ledger isn't in Eleanor's hands," Victor said, turning to look at the captain. "And it isn't in the safe you smashed downstairs. It's not even on this boat anymore." The silence that followed was heavier than the fog. Silas Vance's eyes darted to his brother. Arthur's hand moved toward the inside of his coat, but Victor didn't flinch. "I found the silver key in Dr. Aris's coat," Victor continued, holding it up so the red emergency lights caught the metal. "Locker 14. Pier 47. The doctor wasn't just a record keeper. He was the courier. He offloaded the ledger into a black rubber boat, the one I saw drifting away last night, before you even boarded." Arthur's face darkened to a bruised purple. "You're lying." "Am I?" Victor stepped closer. The marks on the map weren't for the Silver Star. They were the rendezvous points for the courier boat. The captain wasn't checking the hull. He was lowering the doctor's bag into the water. He was trying to save himself from you by making sure the evidence was out of your reach. "The explosives are a lie, Arthur," Victor said, gesturing to the silent black ship. "You need this boat intact because the ledger contains the codes to the offshore accounts from the 1998 heist. If this ship goes up, your fortune stays locked in a digital vault forever." Arthur signaled his men. They reached for their holsters. "Wait!" the captain shouted, suddenly stepping forward with the heavy metal wrench he had used to smash the compass. His face was no longer full of fear, but a desperate, wild anger. "He's right, Arthur. I sent it away. You'll never get the names." In the chaos of the moment, the fog suddenly shifted. A massive, white beam of light cut through the grey veil from the opposite side of the yacht. A siren, real, loud, and authoritative, bellowed across the water. "This is the Coast Guard." A voice boomed over a megaphone. "Cut your engines and prepare to be boarded." Victor smiled. "I didn't just find a beacon in the radio room, Arthur. I fixed the secondary transmitter. My retirement gift screwdriver works on more than just hatches." The bright white beam of the Coast Guard cutter sliced through the fog like a hot knife, exposing the dark deeds on the deck of the Silver Star. The Vance brothers, caught in the sudden glare, looked less like masterminds and more like cornered animals. Armed officers swarmed over the railings, and within minutes, the friend and his lawyer brother were in handcuffs. As the sun finally began to burn away the grey mist, the Silver Star was towed back toward the harbor. Victor stood at the railing, watching the silhouette of the black ship being impounded. The mystery that had begun with a stolen watch had ended with the exposure of a 20-year-old crime. Victor met Eleanor Gable one last time in the main lounge. She was no longer wearing the veil. She looked tired, but the cold hardness in her eyes had softened into something resembling peace. "The Coast Guard found the rubber boat, Eleanor," Victor said. "Dr. Aris was waiting at Pier 47. Just as I suspected. The ledger is in the hands of the authorities. Then it is over," she whispered. "The names of the men who killed my husband are on those pages, including Arthur Vance. I knew if I brought everyone together, the truth would have nowhere to hide." "You took a great risk," Victor noted. You almost became a victim of your own trap. I had a good detective on my side. She replied with a small, knowing smile. Even if he didn't know he was working for me. Victor sat on a crate at the pier later that afternoon, filling out his final report. He organized the fates of the passengers into a clear summary. The captain walked past Victor, carrying a small bag of his belongings. He stopped and looked at the Silver Star one last time. She was a good ship, Mr. King. She just had bad company. Victor nodded. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the old photograph from 1998. He handed it to the captain. Keep this, to remind you of a time before the secrets. As the captain walked away, Victor felt the old energy in his bones begin to fade, replaced by a satisfied weariness. The case was closed. The friend was in a cell, the widow was at peace, and the detective was ready for a very long, very quiet nap. The Silver Star sat silent in the harbor, her lights finally dark, her secrets finally told. The Silver Star was moored at the pier, but the mystery was far from anchored. As the police tape was stretched across the gangway, Victor King noticed a shadow moving behind the frosted glass of the lower portholes, a part of the ship that should have been empty. Victor King stood on the damp pier, the salt air stinging his eyes. The Vance brothers were gone, hauled away in the back of a police cruiser. But a detective's instinct is a bell that doesn't stop ringing just because the light comes on. He looked back at the Silver Star. The yacht sat low in the water, looking tired and beaten. Most of the police were focused on the bridge and the engine room, documenting the sabotage. But Victor's eyes were fixed on the lower galley, a section of the boat used only for long-term food storage. He had seen a flicker of movement, a pale flash that didn't belong to a police officer or a crew member. Victor. The transport is waiting, Eleanor Gable said, stepping up beside him. She looked refreshed, her black dress replaced by a sharp tan trench coat. Go ahead, Eleanor. Victor replied, his eyes never leaving the porthole. I left my notebook in the storage locker. I'll be along in a moment. He didn't wait for her answer. He crossed the gangway, ducking under the yellow tape. The ship was eerily quiet now that the Coast Guard sirens had stopped. He moved down the narrow stairs, past the kitchen where Julian's gold tooth had been found, and deeper into the belly of the ship. The air in the lower galley was freezing. Huge metal freezers hummed. Victor pulled his penlight from his pocket, the one he'd managed to fix with a bit of foil from a gum wrapper. He swung the beam across the room. Stacks of wooden crates filled the space. He walked toward the back, where the smell of salt was replaced by something sweet and chemical, the smell of expensive perfume. I know you're here, Victor said, his voice echoing off the metal walls. The Vance brothers were just the distraction. You're the one who actually knows where the rest of the gold is. From behind a stack of crates labeled fine wine, a young woman stepped out. She couldn't have been more than 25. She wore a simple grey jumpsuit, but her eyes were the same piercing, icy blue as Eleanor Gable's. My mother always said you were too observant for your own good, Mr. King. She whispered. Victor froze. Mother. Eleanor never mentioned a daughter. Eleanor mentions only what serves her. The girl replied, stepping into the light. My name is Isabel, and I'm the reason the ledger was on this boat in the first place. Isabel Gable didn't look like a criminal, but in Victor's experience, the most dangerous ones rarely did. She stood with a poise that suggested she had spent her life in the finest schools, yet her hands were stained with the same dark grease Victor had seen in the engine room. You were the ghost in the ventilation. Victor realized. The voice I heard when I was trapped in the crawl space. Isabel nodded, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. I had to keep you away from the lower deck. If you had found the second vault before the Coast Guard arrived, Arthur Vance would have killed you immediately. I was protecting you, in my own way. By locking me in a dark room? Victor asked, raising an eyebrow. It was the safest place on the boat. She countered. She reached into the pocket of her jumpsuit and pulled out a small, leather-bound cylinder. My mother thinks the ledger is the prize. She thinks exposing the Vance brothers is justice. But she's wrong. The ledger is just a list of names. This is the map to the cargo they actually stole in 1998. Victor took the cylinder. Inside was a roll of high-quality film and a set of GPS coordinates that didn't point to a pier or a city. They pointed to a spot in the middle of the Atlantic, thousands of miles from any trade route. The heist wasn't about gold bars or watches. Isabel explained, her voice dropping to a whisper. It was about a prototype, a deep-sea mining core that was being transported secretly. The '98 heist was a corporate hit, and my father was the only one who realized what the technology was worth. He didn't die in a shootout. He disappeared to hide this. Victor looked at the coordinates. If Isabel was telling the truth, the Silver Star wasn't a crime scene. It was a beacon. And Eleanor Gable wasn't a mourning widow. She was a woman hunting for $1 billion secret that her husband had hidden from everyone, including her. Why tell me? Victor asked. Because the Coast Guard didn't just arrest the Vance brothers. Isabel said, her eyes widening with genuine fear. They're taking the boat to a private shipyard. A shipyard owned by the same company that lost the prototype 28 years ago. We aren't safe here. Mr. King. We have 10 minutes before they realize I'm not on the manifest. Victor knew he should call out for the officers on the deck above. But Isabel's fear was contagious. If she was right, the authorities who had arrived might not be exactly who they seemed. He remembered the black ship. It hadn't had a flag. He had assumed it was the Vances. But what if it was the company? The secondary transmitter. Victor muttered. I set it to a general emergency frequency. Anyone could have picked up that signal. Exactly. Isabel said. She knelt by the floor, pulling up a section of the linoleum that looked perfectly sealed. Beneath it was a heavy steel handle. The Silver Star has a wet porch, a small compartment at the very bottom of the hull where a diver can exit without the boat sinking. My father built it. She pulled the handle, and a section of the floor retracted, revealing a small, moonlit pool of water inside the ship. A two-person underwater scooter was tethered to the side, its battery lights glowing a steady, neon green. The escape plan. Use the scooter to reach the nearby rocky cliffs. The risk. The harbor was full of patrol boats. The gear. 2 sets of oxygen rebreathers sat on the edge. If we stay, the company will interview us, and we will never be seen again. Isabel said, handing Victor a mask. If we go, we have the only map to the core. You're a detective. Victor, do you want to go home to your garden, or do you want to finish the case of a lifetime? Victor looked at the mask, then back at the stairs. He could hear heavy boots on the deck above. They were moving with a precision that didn't sound like the local police. They were searching the cabins one by one. My garden has too many weeds anyway, Victor said, pulling the mask over his face. He and Isabel slipped into the cold, dark water of the hull. The pressure was a sudden weight on his chest, but as they dived beneath the Silver Star, Victor looked up. Through the water, he saw the silhouettes of men with tactical rifles standing on the pier. Isabel turned on the scooter, and with a silent hum, they surged forward into the deep, dark heart of the harbor. The harbor was a labyrinth of cold, black currents and concrete pillars. The silent hum of the underwater scooter was the only thing keeping Victor and Isabel from being swept into the open sea. Above them, the surface of the water flickered with the searchlights of the company patrol boats, their beams cutting through the depths like ghostly fingers. Victor's lungs burned, the rebreather delivering a dry, metallic-tasting air. He clung to the back of the scooter as Isabel steered them toward the base of the great harbor wall. This wasn't just a barrier against the waves. It was an ancient structure filled with forgotten maintenance tunnels and drainage pipes from the old city. Isabel slowed the scooter as they approached a massive iron grate encrusted with barnacles. She reached into a waterproof pouch on her belt and pulled out a small, high-frequency sonic cutter. With the bubbles, the metal began to glow a dull red. The entrance. A rusted intake pipe designed for the city's old cooling system. The depth. 30 feet below the surface. The danger. The current inside the pipe was unpredictable. As the grate fell away into the silt, Isabel pulled Victor inside. The tunnel was narrow and slick with moss. They moved upward, the water level slowly dropping until their heads broke the surface. They were in a dark, vaulted chamber that smelled of salt and damp stone. Victor pulled off his mask, gasping for the humid air. "Where are we?" he whispered, his voice echoing off the curved ceiling. "The foundations of the old customs house," Isabel replied, checking a small waterproof GPS. "My father helped renovate this place in the 90s. He knew that if the company ever came for him, he needed a way to disappear that didn't involve a plane or a car." Victor looked at the girl. She was shivering, but her eyes were fixed on the cylinder he still held. "The coordinates," he said. "They don't just point to the prototype. They point to the reason your father disappeared. He wasn't just hiding technology. He was hiding the evidence that the company had intentionally sunk a rival's ship to get it." "The Auric Pearl." Isabel nodded. 70 sailors died in 1998. "My father was the navigator. He couldn't stop the sinking, but he stole the core data so the company couldn't profit from the massacre." They climbed out of the water and up a rusted spiral staircase that led to the basement of the customs house. The building was a hollow shell, abandoned for years and slated for demolition. Dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight that managed to pierce through the boarded-up windows. Victor's wet boots squeaked on the marble floor. He was a man out of his element, a detective of the streets now entangled in a war of deep-sea shadows. He stopped near a grand, rotting staircase, his ears catching a sound that didn't belong in an abandoned building, the rhythmic click of a computer keyboard. "Someone is here," Victor hissed, pulling Isabel behind a thick stone pillar. They moved toward the source of the sound, a small office at the back of the hall where a single monitor glowed with a soft blue light. Sitting at the desk was a figure Victor recognized instantly, though the man should have been miles away in a Coast Guard interrogation room. It was Silas Vance, the lawyer. He was no longer in his grey suit. He wore a tactical vest and a headset, his fingers flying across the keys. "He didn't get arrested," Victor whispered. "He's part of the company. The arrest was a staged extraction." Silas was speaking into his headset. "The detective and the girl have submerged. We lost the beacon near the sea wall. Activate the thermal drones. If they have the cylinder, they'll head for the secondary relay. Terminate on sight." Victor looked at Isabel. She was clutching a small locket around her neck. "The secondary relay," she mouthed. "It's in this building. It's the only way to broadcast the core data to the public servers before they find us." Victor realized then that this wasn't an escape. It was a race. Silas Vance wasn't just waiting for them. He was the gatekeeper to the truth. Victor knew he couldn't take Silas Vance head-on. The lawyer was younger, faster, and likely armed. But Victor had something Silas didn't: 40 years of experience in the dark corners of the city. He looked at the electrical panel near the office door. "Isabel, when the lights go out, run for the server room at the top of the stairs," Victor commanded in a low tone. "Don't look back. Just upload the files." "What about you?" she asked. "I'm going to have a legal consultation with Mr. Vance," Victor said, a grim smile touching his lips. He reached into the panel and pulled the master lever. The customs house was plunged into absolute darkness. Silas's shout of surprise was followed by the sound of a chair crashing. Victor moved with the silence of a predator, guided by the memory of the room's layout. He heard Silas draw a weapon, the metallic snick of a safety being moved. "I know you're in here, King," Silas yelled. "Give me the cylinder, and I'll make sure your retirement is short and painless." Victor didn't answer. He threw a heavy glass paperweight toward the opposite corner of the room. Silas fired twice, the muzzle flashes illuminating his panicked face for a split second. That was all Victor needed. He lunged, tackling the lawyer around the waist and sending them both crashing through the rotting wooden partition. They tumbled into the hallway, the cylinder rolling across the floor. Isabel dove for it, her fingers brushing the leather. "Run!" Victor roared, pinning Silas's arm to the floor. As Isabel scrambled up the stairs, the sound of a helicopter began to thump loudly outside. The thermal drones had arrived. The company was no longer playing games. The customs house was being surrounded, and Victor King was trapped in a wrestling match with a man who had sold his soul for a corporate paycheck. The air in the old customs house was thick with the scent of ozone and ancient dust. The roar of the helicopter blades above was a rhythmic thumping that vibrated through the floorboards, shaking the very foundations of the building. Victor King, a man who preferred the quiet click of a solved puzzle, was now in the middle of a war zone. Silas Vance was stronger than he looked. He twisted under Victor, his elbow catching the detective in the ribs. Victor gasped, his grip loosening just enough for Silas to reach for the pistol he'd dropped during the fall. "You're a relic, King," Silas hissed, his face contorted in the flickering red light of the building's emergency sirens. "The world doesn't belong to men with notebooks anymore. It belongs to those who control the flow of the information." Before Silas could level the weapon, the roof of the customs house exploded. Not with fire, but with light. High-intensity tactical strobes poured through the rotting skylights, blinding them both. The company had arrived, and they weren't coming in through the front door. The insertion. 4 operatives in matte black armor descended on fast ropes from the helicopter. The weaponry. Suppressed submachine guns with laser sights that cut through the dust. The directive. Silence all witnesses. Victor rolled behind a heavy mahogany desk, the wood splintering as a burst of gunfire shredded the air where his head had been a second ago. He saw Silas scramble toward the back exit, shouting into his headset. The lawyer was no longer the company's golden boy. He was a liability being left behind in the crossfire. "Isabel!" Victor shouted, his voice nearly drowned out by the helicopter. He didn't see her, but he heard the heavy metal door of the server room slam shut at the top of the grand staircase. She was in. Now he just had to buy her enough time to hit send. Victor sprinted for the staircase, staying low to avoid the laser sights dancing across the walls. He felt a sharp sting in his shoulder, a graze from a bullet. But he didn't stop. He reached the heavy iron doors of the server room and threw himself inside, bolting the lock just as a hail of leads slammed into the other side. The room was freezing, filled with the hum of ancient servers that Isabel had somehow brought back to life using the yacht's portable battery pack. She was hunched over a terminal, the leather cylinder open beside her. The film was threaded into a high-resolution scanner, and a progress bar on the monitor crawled forward with agonizing slowness. Upload progress. 42%. They're outside the door. Victor panted, pressing his back against the vibrating metal. They have thermal imaging and enough C4 to level this wing. "I need 3 minutes, Victor," Isabel said without looking up. Her fingers danced across the keyboard, bypassing the old security protocols of the 1990s hardware. "If I stop now, the data will be corrupted and the Auric Pearl massacre will stay a secret forever." Victor looked around the room. It was a dead end. No windows, 1 door, and a wall of humming processors. Then he saw it. The old fire suppression system. A series of heavy red canisters labeled Halan 1301. Isabel, when I give the word, put on your rebreather. Victor commanded. He moved to the manual release valve. Halan gas would displace the oxygen in the room instantly. It would stop a fire, and it would stop a tactical team. But it would also stop a detective if he wasn't careful. He checked the seal on his own mask. He had one match left in his pocket. He wasn't going to light it. He was going to use it to jam the door's sensor. The iron door groaned. A muffled thump told Victor they had placed a breaching charge. Progress. Victor barked. 89%. 90%. Isabel's voice was steady, though her hands were shaking. The door blew. The explosion was a wall of heat and sound that threw Victor across the room. The tactical team moved in through the smoke, their silhouettes ghostly in the strobe lights. But Victor was already at the valve. He yanked the handle. A deafening hiss filled the room as the Halan gas flooded the space. The operatives' movements slowed almost instantly as the oxygen vanished. Their sophisticated gas masks were designed for smoke and tear gas, but Halan worked on a molecular level. They began to stumble, their aim going wild. Victor watched through his mask as the monitor flashed a bright, brilliant green. Upload complete. Recipient. Global Press Syndicate. Isabel let out a breath that fogged her mask. The secret was out. The billion-dollar core data, the names of the company executives, and the truth about the 1998 heist were now on every major news server in the world. But the victory was short-lived. Through the thick haze of the Halan gas, a single figure emerged. He wasn't wearing a tactical suit. He wore a simple, tailored coat and a high-grade oxygen mask. It was Arthur Vance. He hadn't been in a cell. He had been the one directing the helicopter. He didn't look at the tactical team gasping on the floor. He looked at Victor, and he held a remote detonator in his hand. If I can't have the secret. Arthur's voice muffled through his mask. Then no one leaves the archive to talk about it. The server room was a graveyard of cold air and gasping men. Arthur Vance stood amidst the swirling Halan gas, his eyes burning with a cold, desperate fire behind his oxygen mask. The red light on his detonator pulsed like a dying heart. He didn't care about the corporate data anymore. He cared about the silence that only an explosion could provide. Victor King felt the lack of oxygen pressing against his temples, even with the rebreather. The room was a blur of shadows and the sharp, clinical hiss of the fire suppression system. Arthur Vance took a step forward, his thumb hovering over the detonator's button. He looked at the monitor. The glowing upload complete message was a death warrant for his entire legacy. You think you've won, King. Arthur's voice was a metallic rasp through his mask. You've sent a file. Files can be deleted. Servers can be seized. But dead men don't testify. Victor didn't look at the detonator. He looked at the floor. The tactical team's breach had cracked a heavy coolant pipe running beneath the server racks. A pool of liquid nitrogen was beginning to spread toward Arthur's boots. The Halan isn't just taking the air, Arthur, Victor said, his voice muffled by his own mask. It's a pressurized system. This whole floor is a tinderbox of static and sub-zero liquid. If you press that button, the explosion won't just level the building. It'll trigger a chemical chain reaction. You won't just die, you'll be vaporized. Arthur hesitated. It was the moment Victor needed. He didn't lunge for the man. He lunged for the server rack itself. He grabbed a heavy, metal-cased processor and shoved it with all his strength. The rack, already loosened by the breach, groaned and toppled. It didn't hit Arthur, but it smashed into the coolant pipe, sending a geyser of freezing mist directly into the path of the tactical team and the exit. Isabel. The ventilation shaft. Victor roared. He grabbed the girl and shoved her toward a small, narrow intake duct near the ceiling. It was the only way out that wasn't blocked by ice or gunmen. As they scrambled upward, the first of Arthur's charges, set at the base of the building, went off. The customs house shuddered, the floor tilting at a terrifying angle. The ventilation shaft was a narrow, horizontal coffin of galvanized steel. Victor could hear the building screaming around them as the structural supports began to fail. Behind them, the roar of the Haylan was replaced by the terrifying sound of fire. Arthur had pressed the button, but the chemical geyser had delayed the primary blast just enough to give them a head start. "Keep moving," Victor urged, the heat of the fire now licking at the metal beneath them. "The shaft leads to the outer pier wall." Isabel was sobbing, her breath coming in ragged gasps through the mask. "It's all falling apart, Victor. We're not going to make it. We made it off the Silver Star." Victor barked, his detective's voice returning with a sharp, commanding edge. "We made it through the sea wall. This is just a chimney. Move." They crawled through the soot and dust, the metal burning Victor's palms. The shaft began to twist. Suddenly, the section of duct behind them simply vanished, falling into the inferno below. They were hanging over a 5-story drop into the burning basement. Victor grabbed the edge of the next section, his muscles screaming. He swung Isabel across the gap first, then hauled himself over as the last of the supports gave way. They reached a heavy iron grate at the end of the line. Through the slats, Victor could see the moonlit harbor and the cold, dark water. But they weren't alone. A second helicopter, blacker than the first, was hovering just 50 feet away. Its spotlight hit the grate, blinding them. "They're waiting for us," Isabel whispered. "No," Victor said, squinting into the light. "Look at the tail number. That's not a company bird. That's the maritime police. The upload worked. The world is watching now." The heat was now unbearable. The customs house was a torch, lighting up the entire harbor. The police helicopter moved closer, its side door sliding open. A winch line dropped toward them, swaying in the turbulent air created by the fire's heat. "We have to jump for it," Victor said. He kicked at the iron grate with his heavy boots. 1 kick. 2. On the third, the rusted bolts snapped, and the grate tumbled into the sea below. The gap between the burning building and the helicopter's cable was 10 feet of empty, smoky air. Below them, the harbor was a chaotic mess of debris and fireboats. Victor grabbed the edge of the opening, looking at Isabel. "On 3. He said. "Don't look down. Look at the man on the cable." They didn't wait for 3. A secondary explosion inside the server room sent a shockwave that blew them both out of the opening. Victor felt the terrifying sensation of weightlessness, the cold harbor air rushing past him. His hands flailed in the dark, and then, impact. He slammed into the winch operator, his fingers locking onto the steel cable with a strength he didn't know he possessed. He looked down. Isabel was dangling from his other arm, her hand gripped firmly around his wrist. The helicopter surged upward just as the old customs house collapsed into a mountain of fire and stone. From the air, the harbor looked like a map of glowing embers. Victor saw the lights of a dozen police cruisers and news vans descending on the pier. He pulled Isabel into the cabin of the helicopter. They collapsed onto the metal floor, covered in soot, salt, and blood. An officer leaned over them, shouting over the roar of the rotors. "Victor King. We got the data. It's everywhere." The company's board of directors just got served with 500 warrants. Victor pulled off his mask and took his first breath of clean air in hours. He looked at Isabel, who was clutching the empty leather cylinder. "The case is closed, Isabel," Victor whispered. "Truly closed." But as he looked out the window at the receding fire, he saw a single, small black boat moving silently away from the wreckage, heading toward the open sea. Arthur Vance was gone. The war was over, but the shadows were already moving again. The smoke from the customs house was a pillar of black ink against the morning sky. Victor King sat in the back of a police ambulance, a thermal blanket draped over his shoulders. He watched the harbor bustle with activity. The company was being dismantled in real time, its assets frozen and its executives in handcuffs. But Victor wasn't looking at the arrests. He was looking at the horizon. The medical technician tried to check Victor's pulse, but the detective gently pushed his hand away. He stood up, his bones aching with a deep, marrow-deep cold. Isabel was nearby, surrounded by federal agents. She looked small in her oversized police jacket, but her eyes remained fixed on Victor. She knew what he was thinking. "The black boat," she said, walking toward him as the agents gave them space. "You saw it too. Arthur Vance isn't a man who dies in a fire he started." Victor replied. He looked at the harbor map spread out on a nearby patrol car. The wet porch on the Silver Star wasn't the only escape route. The customs house had a sub-basement connected to the old saw lines. He didn't stay to watch the building fall. He was already in the water. Victor pointed to a specific point on the map. The Needle Rocks, a jagged formation 3 miles offshore where the currents were notoriously dangerous. The sighting. A small, low-profile craft with no lights. The velocity. Moving at a speed that suggested a high-performance engine. The destination. An uncharted buoy where a deep-sea submersible could be waiting. He's going for the prototype itself. Isabel whispered. "The data we uploaded tells the world what it is. But Arthur wants the physical core. If he has the hardware, he can rebuild his empire in a country that doesn't have an extradition treaty." Victor didn't hesitate. He walked over to the commander of the Maritime Police. "I need a fast interceptor. No sirens. No lights. And I need a pilot who doesn't mind breaking a few maritime laws." The commander looked at the soot-covered detective. He had seen the data. He knew Victor was the only reason the truth had survived the night. "Boat 42 is fueled and ready, Mr. King. But if you go out there, you're on your own. We can't risk a jurisdictional nightmare in international waters. I've been on my own since I boarded the Silver Star," Victor said. The interceptor boat was a streak of silver across the choppy Atlantic. Victor stood at the helm, his eyes squinting through the sea spray. Beside him, Isabel checked the sonar. They were nearing the Needle Rocks, where the water turned a violet, churning white. "I see him," Isabel shouted over the roar of the twin engines. A mile ahead, the small black boat was bobbing near a massive, rusted buoy. A crane was lowering a tether into the water. Arthur Vance was there, his silhouette unmistakable against the rising sun. He was frantically trying to winch something heavy from the depths. The physical prototype of the mining core. "He's almost got it," Isabel cried. "Victor, if he secures that core to his boat, he'll have enough weight to dive. That craft is a semi-submersible." Victor pushed the throttles to the wall. The interceptor lurched forward, skipping across the tops of the waves. He wasn't going to outshoot Arthur, and he wasn't going to outmaneuver him. He was going to use the one thing a detective always relies on: the environment. "The buoy," Victor yelled. "It's a navigational marker for the deep trench. If we hit the tether, the tension will snap the crane." He steered the interceptor into a wide, dangerous arc, aiming for the thick steel cable that connected Arthur's boat to the ocean floor. Arthur saw them coming. He abandoned the winch and reached for a flare gun, firing a burning red streak into the air. It wasn't a signal for help. It was a distraction. The flare hit the interceptor's windshield, blooming into a wall of blinding magnesium light. Victor didn't turn away. He closed his eyes, relying on his internal sense of the boat's momentum. He felt the impact, a jarring, metallic screech as the interceptor's reinforced bow struck the cable. The cable didn't snap immediately. Instead, it acted like a giant rubber band, pulling both boats together in a violent collision. The interceptor's engines stalled, the propellers fouled by the tether. Victor and Isabel were thrown to the deck as the two vessels smashed into the side of the rusted buoy. Arthur Vance climbed out of his cockpit, a heavy iron crowbar in his hand. He looked like a ghost, his skin pale and his clothes scorched from the customs house fire. He lunged for the interceptor, landing on the prow. "You just don't know when to retire, King," Arthur screamed, swinging the crowbar. Victor blocked the blow with a boat hook, the vibration rattling his teeth. "The ledger is public, Arthur. There's nowhere to go. Even the company has disowned you." "I don't need the company," Arthur roared. He pointed to the winch, where the massive, barnacle-encrusted core was finally breaking the surface. It was a sphere of dark titanium, glowing with a faint, internal power. "This is worth more than 1,000 companies. It's the future of energy, and it's mine." As Arthur turned back to the winch, the buoy beneath them groaned. The added weight of the three boats and the core was too much for the old anchors. The buoy began to tilt, the massive steel structure sliding toward the deep trench. "The buoy is going down," Isabel screamed, grabbing a life ring. The prototype core, still tethered to Arthur's boat, began to roll. It was a 3-ton anchor dragging the small black craft toward the abyss. Arthur scrambled to cut the line, but his hands were shaking too hard. The winch jammed. "Give me your hand, Arthur," Victor shouted, reaching across the gap between the sinking vessels. "Let it go. It's not worth your life." Arthur looked at Victor, then at the glowing titanium sphere that represented 20 years of blood and secrets. He didn't take Victor's hand. He reached for the core, hugging the cold metal as if it were his own child. The buoy gave way. The cable snapped, but it didn't release the boat. It lashed around Arthur's waist. In a second, the core, the boat, and Arthur Vance were dragged into the black depths of the Atlantic. Victor watched the bubbles rise for a long minute, but the sea remained silent. The weight of the sin had finally taken its toll. The Atlantic was calm now, the surface of the water a sheet of glass reflecting the pale, bruised colors of a winter dawn. The bubbles from Arthur's final descent had long since vanished, leaving only a few floating pieces of debris and a film of iridescent oil. Victor and Isabel sat on the deck of the stalled interceptor, two survivors of a storm that had lasted 28 years. The rescue tugs arrived an hour later, their sirens low and respectful. As they towed the interceptor back toward the city, Victor watched the skyline emerge from the morning mist. The towering glass buildings of the company still stood, but they looked hollow now, skeletons of an empire that had been decapitated by a single file upload. 1 month later, the world was a different place. The Auric Pearl massacre was the lead story in every newspaper, and a global investigation had been launched into deep-sea corporate ethics. Victor King stood in his small garden, the smell of damp earth and blooming jasmine a welcome change from salt and smoke. He was holding a pair of pruning shears, looking at a stubborn hedge that had grown wild during his vacation. A car pulled up to the curb, a simple, unassuming sedan. Isabel Gable stepped out. She looked different. She was dressed in a professional suit, her hair pulled back. She looked like a woman who had found her own path. "The lawyers are finally done with me, Victor," she said, leaning against the white picket fence. "They've officially declared the prototype lost. The company is being liquidated to pay the families of the 70 sailors." "And your mother?" Victor asked, clipping a stray branch. "She's in Switzerland," Isabel replied. "She finally retired. She sent you this." She handed him a small, wooden box. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet, was the gold watch with the diamond-encrusted face. It was clean, ticking perfectly, its rhythmic heartbeat of a story that was finally over. She wants you to have it, Isabel said. To remind you that time is the only thing we can't get back. Victor looked at the watch. He remembered the cold deck of the Silver Star, the smell of the doctor's cologne, and the shivering captain. He remembered the weight of the secrets and the coldness of the deep. He closed the box and tucked it into his pocket. I have enough reminders, Isabel, he said softly. The department called me, you know, she added, her eyes twinkling. They want to know if you'd be interested in a consultant position for the new Maritime Crimes Unit. They say they need someone who knows how to read the fog. Victor looked at his garden. The weeds were mostly gone. The roses were beginning to climb the trellis, and the sun was warm on his back. He thought about the notebook in his desk, filled with the names of those he had saved and those he had lost. Tell them, Victor said, a small, weary smile crossing his face, that the detective is officially retired. But he paused, looking toward the horizon where the sea met the sky. If they ever find another friend on a boat, tell them to call someone else first. And if that doesn't work, tell them I'll be right here, tending to my roses. Isabel laughed, waved a final goodbye, and drove away. Victor King stood in the quiet of his garden, the gold watch ticking in his pocket. He picked up his shears and returned to his work. The mystery was solved, the truth was told, and for the first time in 40 years, Victor King was simply a man in a garden.